In order to transition into the consciousness portion, there were a couple of other things I wanted to go over. First, unrelated to what's on the screen, I'll just briefly describe the difficulty with the 3-degree background radiation, which some of you may have read about in newspapers or articles as being one of the primary evidences for the Big Bang model. But I think it's also can be used as evidence for what I call this apparitional model. See, in the apparitional model, there isn't a creation event. You know, when you find yourself dreaming, it doesn't start with titles, and there's no roaring lion or MGM or a universal globe or something that tells you your dream has now started. You just find yourself there. When it's an apparitional universe, it's something you're doing now, and it's just ongoing. So there doesn't have to be a creation event. And in Swami Vivekananda's writing, he says that in the Hindu scriptures there are two theories about the universe coming into creation and then coming into contraction in various huge cycles. And he says that you could also say that it's happening sort of piecemeal, that at various times there's a manifest universe over here, and then another one's manifesting over here, and then this one's kind of collapsing, and then this one's expanding and collapsing and so forth, sort of, so that it's sort of an ongoing thing, and there's never a time when there isn't creation. And he says that he actually favors that particular viewpoint. And I actually think that there's some mythological connections here as well. The myth of Indra refers to how there are many Indras for each Brahma and many Brahmas for the entire creation. And I think that perhaps the Indras refer to star systems and the Brahmas refer to galaxies. And of course we know that there are many, many galaxies. And we know that the stars go through their life cycles, and probably galaxies go through their life cycles as well. So my suspicion is that that myth is referring to this process of sort of individual galaxies coming into existence and going out of existence and so forth. Now, to understand this 3-degree background radiation, I need to tell you a few things that many of you may know, but may not. When we observe this universe, what we see, as we mentioned before, is that everything seems to be going away from us. Now, how do we intuit that it's going away from us? Well, it's called the redshift, and has to do with what happens when you observe something that's going away from you, that's emitting a light source. Light waves occur in frequencies, and the longer frequencies are red and the shorter frequencies are blue. Now, of course, there are even more frequencies at both ends of that, but of the ones that we can see, the shorter ones are blue and the longer ones are red. And so if the light source is going away from you, the waves get extended, and so the light source looks redder to you than it would if you were riding alongside of it. Or if you were riding in front of it, it would look bluer because the waves would get compressed. And so we know the kinds of spectrums that stars should emit in the universe because it comes in discrete spectrum. And we can see that all the spectral lines are shifted in one direction or another. So this is how we have figured out that things are going away from us in every direction that you look. It's not like they're going away from us in one direction and not in another. On average, everything is going away. And this is supposed to be the evidence of the Big Bang. But it turns out there's also a way to interpret this that works for this apparitional model. And again, it goes back to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. If a particle is going away from you, its energy will get more and more redshifted. Now, the boundary of the observable universe occurs because at some point, if things keep speeding up, going away from you faster and faster and faster, pretty soon they approach the speed of light. Well, if they've approached the speed of light, the light waves aren't going to get to you. They're going to be so extended that they will no longer reach you. And so this creates this boundary to the observable universe. Now, what happens to those particles as seen by you as they get closer and closer to this horizon of the universe where things are going away at the speed of light? Well, as they get red-shifted, because red energy or red wavelengths represent a lower energy state, it means that the energy of those particles, as seen by you, remember this is an apparitional universe in this model, and everything is as seen by you. There isn't anything that's actual. It's an as seen by you universe. So as seen by you, those particles appear to have lower and lower and lower energy. Now, if they have lower and lower and lower energy, that means that you can't make a very big mistake about what kind of energy they have. You see, I can mistake this for, maybe a gram or two, but I can't mistake it for a ton. I can't be that far off. When you take a small object, you can't be that far off from it. So if you're very certain that the thing is very close to no energy at all, you can't make a very big mistake about nothing. So if you can't make a big mistake about its energy, then you can make a huge mistake about where it is. And it could be anywhere. So you get less and less certain about where these things are as they approach the boundary of your observable universe. And I think they recycle in as fresh hydrogen. Now, there is some evidence that there is fresh hydrogen that we don't expect. The Hubble telescope has actually measured clouds of hydrogen between some of the galaxy clusters that they really weren't expecting. Now, I don't think they think that that's going to be typical all over the universe, and the Hubble hasn't been able to do a full measure of the entire universe. But I have a feeling it is. I think the fresh hydrogen keeps recycling into our observable universe. And this universe is more like a barber pole, where the spirals of the barber pole just keep going on forever, and there's no end to it. It just appears to begin at one place and end at another. So in our observable universe, the energy of the particles in the universe simply recycle in your observable universe, and it turns out that you get the same 3-degree background radiation if you analyze what happens to the energy of low rest mass particles as their wavelengths as the wavelengths come through all these low rest mass particles. If radiation is coming to you through a field of low rest mass particles, they get picked up and radiated frequently enough that they end up all radiating at about 3 degrees Kelvin. So this is another interpretation of the background radiation that fits this model. Now, this model is not going to take off because people are materialists. Most physicists are materialists, and that's a huge jump in perspective. I mean, just think what it took to swallow Einstein's idea that time and space were relative, or quantum physics, that you can only describe things with uncertainty and as probability waves. To think of the world as ultimately unreal or apparitional is a huge jump in paradigm. It's a huge paradigm shift. And actually, I think the physicists are a lot closer to it than the biological scientists. The biological scientists are still trying to mimic the physics of the 1800s, and they're more materialistic than the physicists are. But that aside, we will now continue with the next very interesting thing, which is the 5 elements. If you remember the 5 elements of antiquity, it's Akasha, Vayu, Tejas, Apa, and Prithivi. And these are associated in our scriptures with our 5 sense organs. Now, why would they bother to identify these 5 elements with our 5 sense organs? Well, your 5 sense organs all have a specialized function to pick up energy of a certain type. Now, the first one's a little obscure, but your ear has your sense of gravity or your sense of balance in it. Your semicircular canal in your ear keeps your balance. And so your ear really is associated with gravity. And then your eye picks up kinetic energy, your skin picks up kinetic energy, the energy of temperature. And your eye picks up radiation, that's tejas, and your tongue actually does sense electricity. Protons taste sour. Anything that's acidic produces protons, and protons are nothing but a positive charge, and they taste sour. And your nose detects magnetic bonds, things that have similar magnetic structures, or molecular structures due to their magnetic, the way they're set up magnetically, will smell the same to you. And so these 5 energies really are associated with the 5 sense organs, and that's why the 5 elements really are the bricks of the universe. We used to think that this was some sort of, antiquated way. Wasn't that cute? This is the way they used to think of the world. I'm just absolutely astounded when you think that these ancient sages, as Swamiji said last night, all knowledge is within them. And somehow they intuited that the universe is made up of energy, and that these are the 5 basic energies that we have sense organs for. Now, they left out nuclear energy, but we don't have a sense for nuclear energy, so how would they talk about it? But they picked these up, and they knew that the universe was made out of energy. E equals mc squared. It is energy, and it's these 5 energies, and we have a sense organ for each one. Now, the other interesting thing is, we would not have a sense organ to detect light if individual atoms weren't able to respond to photons. But an atom, when it's hit by a photon, can jump one electron to one of another energy level, and then it can emit a photon by jumping back down, and so forth. The atoms can respond to kinetic energy. They can respond to electric energy. They can respond to magnetic energy. The individual atoms respond to these 5 energies because they are made up of these 5 energies. This is a universe of oneness. It all comes out of Brahman. And it all comes out of Brahman in this mysterious way. And it's made up of these 5 energies. And because the atoms are made up of 5 energies, they can detect these 5 energies. And because they do, we can do it. We just have sophisticated organs. But if it weren't for the atom's ability to sense these things, we couldn't sense these things. There's no way you could develop an eye that's sensitive to radiation if the atoms couldn't respond to radiation. So in this very curious way, the universe is made up of energy, and the atoms have a certain sentiency to them. And so if you want to think of it this way, you could think of this as sort of a rudimentary consciousness. And I like to think that consciousness is the ground of existence. Again, we call it Sat Chit Ananda. It's that Chit portion of that trio. And again, it's not really 3 things, it's really 1. But from our perspective, we can't talk about it very well unless we divide it up into understandable units. And consciousness is one of those more understandable units for figuring out the nature of this universe. And I think it goes all the way back to the individual atom. Now, that being said, there is something uniquely different about living organisms as opposed to non-living organisms. And as we said, it has to do with their ability to direct energy through them and to continue. So we do have these rather interesting comparisons. But if we look at our spiritual heroes, Sri Ramakrishna and his direct disciples and so forth, we'll find that they frequently will refer to consciousness as the ground of existence. And of course there's quite a bit of debate among neuroscientists and so forth. Most neuroscientists are trying to get consciousness as an epiphenomenon of the brain and the matter in the brain. And while they're coming up with some very interesting correlates, I think they will never completely succeed if they don't admit that consciousness has to be in there from the beginning. It doesn't just suddenly appear, it's there from the beginning. But the difficulty is that this word consciousness is used in all sorts of ways. In some sense, we're all very sloppy about it. Even Swami Vivekananda, when he uses the term, you have to know what context he's talking about. For example, we will often say that if someone is knocked on the head, they may be knocked unconscious. But that's a different use of the word unconscious from you're digesting your food unconsciously, or he's played this musical instrument so long he doesn't even have to think about it. It's an unconscious process, and he can carry on a conversation while he's playing the music. So this word unconscious is used in too many ways. We even use the term unconscious to mean both subconscious and superconscious. Anything that's not normal consciousness is sometimes called the unconscious, so that becomes confusing. So we're going to have to probably develop new terminology of some sort to distinguish various shades of meaning. And in fact, in English, we often have to do that. We'll talk about absolute consciousness, or normal consciousness, or waking consciousness, or subliminal consciousness, or intuitive consciousness. And we have to use all these modifiers to make sense out of our language. But I find it a very useful model. And so we're going to look at some interesting quotes from people and some interesting ways of looking at the universe as consciousness. In our prayer that we say before meals, we say that Brahman is the ritual, Brahman is the offering, Brahman is it who offers to the fire that is Brahman. If we see Brahman in every action, we will find Brahman. Well, one of the ways to do that is to think about consciousness pervading the universe, and thinking about how everything you're interacting with is a little whirlpool of consciousness. So we're going to look at that aspect this hour. Now, since it's Swami Atmavidyananda's birthday, let's start with some quotes from him. He says, "God is not outside us, but it is all-pervading. That being dwells in human beings, in every atom of the universe, like we just described, in plants, in minerals, in all living creatures. In fact, everything in the universe that we perceive with our senses has its life, existence, and end in that being." And in Buddhism, they have the saying, "One perfect nature pervades and circulates within all natures. One all-inclusive reality contains and embraces all realities." Swami Atmavidyananda, another direct disciple, said, "God is the infinite existence. God permeates all space and is woven into all things. God is immanent, all-pervading, unaffected by forms or boundaries. He is all and transcends all." Judaism, in the Kabbalah, describes two orders of reality, one transcendent and one immanent. According to the Zohar, if one contemplates things in mystical meditation, everything is revealed as one. So it's this mystery of being transcendent and immanent at the same time, simultaneously changing and unchanging. I should mention, you see that that's the big problem. You start with Brahman as the infinite, undivided and unchanging. How do you get a universe out of it if it's unchanging? That's the difficulty. And so Shankara's very clever approach was to say, well, it's an apparition. So it hasn't actually changed, but it has the power to manifest a universe like a magic show. And I like that analogy too. My dad used to do magic tricks. And so a magician creates an illusion and makes you think something is happening that's not happening. Now, it's not that it's completely unreal. There's an actual magician up there, and there are actual objects up there, but you think that something is happening that's not happening. And the dream analogy, we've also gone into that. And of course, the other analogy I like, we'll look at this afternoon with music. Here's a Christian mystic saying pretty much the same thing. Consciousness, the ground of being, is within our intellects, souls, and bodies, in heaven, on earth. whilst remaining the same in itself. It is at once in, around, and above the world. Super celestial, super essential, a sun, a star, fire, water, spirit, dew, cloud, stone, rock, all it is. Now you see, if you didn't know who's saying this, you would be difficult to even pin down what tradition it was from. They're all saying the same thing. Once you get to that mystical understanding, there's this mysterious oneness of the universe that's all pervading everything that we see, even though it appears as many. The Taoist says, the Tao is in indefinable original totality. Ideas create the appearance of separate things. Always hidden, it is the mysterious essence. Always manifest, it is the outer appearances. Essence and appearance are the same. Only ideas make them seem separate. Mystified? Tao is mystery. This is the gateway to understanding. And the beauty of Hinduism is that it's been able to retain these two great ideas, that this world is somehow unreal and yet real at the same time. And Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda propounded these ideas so skillfully and beautifully with their analogies and teachings. Even in ancient Egypt, they had this idea. To conceive of Atum is difficult. To define him is impossible. The imperfect and impermanent cannot easily apprehend the eternally perfected. Atum is whole and constant. In himself he is motionless, yet he is self-moving. He is immaculate, incorruptible, and everlasting. He is the supreme, absolute reality. He is filled with ideas which are imperceptible to the senses, and with all-embracing knowledge. Atum is primal mind. So when you see all the different traditions pointing at the same thing, there's got to be something to it. You can't just feel that they're all wrong. They've all got to be saying basically the same thing in different words, and there's got to be a reality to it. So it seems like there is this mysterious connection, that there's this mysterious oneness that's unchangeable, and yet it permeates everything we see that appears to be changing. It's motionless, self-moving. As Shankara says, it's Maya, which is a peculiar, incomprehensible mixture of real and unreal. Is the world real or unreal? Yes, it is. It's sort of like, again, going back to the dream analogy, which I like a lot, because when you're dreaming, everything seems very real. And yet when you wake up, it's just a dream. But it doesn't mean it was not real. It was a real dream. You actually had a dream. It wasn't like you made the whole thing up. There was an actual dream, and there's a dream process going on in the brain, but it was not the reality you thought it was. When you were in the dream, when you wake up, you realize what kind of reality it was. Sri Ramakrishna said, if there is butter, there must be buttermilk also. If you think of butter, you must also think of buttermilk along with it. For there cannot be any butter without buttermilk. Buttermilk's not so common anymore, though. So, see, in his day, in his context, it was a great example. How many here have had buttermilk? Yeah, okay, most of you, good. Just so, if you accept the nitya, you must accept the lila. It is the process of negation and affirmation. You realize the nitya by negating the lila. Then you affirm the lila by seeing in it the manifestation of the nitya. One attains this state after realizing reality in both aspects, personal and impersonal. The personal is the embodiment of chit, consciousness, or knowledge. And the impersonal is the indivisible, Satchidananda. Brahman alone has become everything. Therefore, to the Vijnani, this world is a mansion of mirth. But to the Jnani, it is a framework of illusion. Brahman and Shakti are like the snake and its wriggling motion. So these are the kinds of analogies that Sri Ramakrishna would use to get this idea across. So we've already mentioned earlier today that there's this basic idea in our mythologies that the original creation out of the primordial oneness, out of which the duality arises, is this perceiver-perceived or subject-object split. Now the interesting thing about this is that it gives us what's called, in philosophical language, a tangled hierarchy. And this is why when you're in the realm of duality, it becomes so difficult to understand. A tangled hierarchy is one in which you cannot say one created the other. It's the old chicken and egg problem, which came first, the chicken or the egg. So the same thing comes about here. Which came first, the subject or the object? Are we going to be idealists and say everything came out of the subject, or are we going to be materialists and say everything came out of the object? Well, it doesn't happen that way. They came out together from the oneness. And the best example I've seen of this is the sketching of Escher. Are you familiar with the artist Escher that draws all these peculiar pictures where the stairs look like they're going up and then you follow the stairs and all of a sudden you're down on the first floor again? So there are all these sort of paradoxical pictures. And the one that illustrates this tangled hierarchy the best is drawing hands. He's got two hands, one drawing the other. And so you can't say that this one's drawing this one, you can't say this one's drawing this one, and yet it appears that both of them are drawing each other. And so this is a tangled hierarchy. And this is why our scientists will be having a very difficult time trying to figure out how to get consciousness out of matter, or matter out of consciousness, because they arise together as a tangled hierarchy from the oneness. And you see, Descartes is one of the people that's frequently blamed for Western dualism. He felt that mind and matter were this sort of irreconcilable dichotomy, that they were two completely different realms. But that brought about all sorts of different problems as well. Then how do they interact? How can the mind affect matter and so forth? Or do they just sort of run in parallel to each other? So these are some of the problems that philosophers deal with. So Descartes solved the problem by assuming that God, who had created both mind and matter, is able to relate them by putting into the minds of human beings the clear and distinct thoughts that are needed to deal with matter. But then if you discard God, as the materialists did, then you have to ask, how does mind arise out of matter? And then, how can the mind affect matter? Or does it merely reflect matter? Is everything predetermined and all your thoughts just the consequences of the way molecules are running around in your brain? It's a little difficult for me to swallow, but that's the kind of thing they're trying to get at. It seems to me that we really need to see consciousness as a spectrum, and as I said, we don't really have adequate words to describe all of these various shades of consciousness. But there's this ability of atoms to sense energy. That's a sort of a rudimentary sentiency, which leads to some sort of awareness in the environment and an ability to respond to the environment, much as a plant is able to turn its leaves towards the sun and its roots are able to go towards the moisture in the soil and so forth, and work their ways around barriers. So there's a certain awareness. And then there's this idea of self-awareness, where you become aware that you are a distinct individual and that you have some awareness of what it is you're doing and what your thoughts are doing and so forth. Self-awareness is a very difficult term to describe, and yet it's something we all sort of feel we know what it is. And then there's this idea of what philosophers call qualia, what it is to experience something. What is it to you when you hear a beautiful raga? Or what is it to you when you see a beautiful sunset? What does blue look like to you? What does a poem sound like to you? So what does silk feel like to you? These things are completely subjective, and there's no good way to handle the problem of qualia with a physical interpretation of the universe. The physicist and author Nick Herbert said that science's biggest mystery is the nature of consciousness. That is the new frontier, basically. David Chalmers, a professor of cognitive science, says that conscious experience is at once the most familiar thing in the world and yet the most mysterious. There is nothing we know about more directly than consciousness, but it is extraordinarily hard to reconcile it with everything else we know. Why does it exist? What does it do? How could it possibly arise from neural processes in the brain? And he describes the hard problem as the question of how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experiences. This puzzle involves the inner aspects of thought and perception, the way we feel for the subject experience of blue and so forth. David Bohm, in an attempt to find an intelligible relationship between mind and matter without reducing one to another, but a function or aspect of the other, his approach ends up taking various forms of materialism, which reduces mind to an epiphenomenon of matter. Stephen Weinberg says that the existence of consciousness does not seem to be derivable from physical laws and doesn't know where it comes from. So we have these problems that baffle us. There are some people that are making some inroads, trying to put consciousness on a firmer foundation. Amit Goswami has a series of books. I'm not very clear about his concept of what he calls the quantum monad, which is supposed to be our individual sense of consciousness, which then reincarnates until it realizes its oneness. That's his concept. To me, it's not a terribly clear one yet. Chalmers deals, not Chalmers, but Sheldrake deals with what he calls morphogenic fields, which again is something sort of bigger than the totality, which is directing things in the physical plane. The older philosopher named Fechner had sort of a panpsychism feeling, where again he felt that consciousness imbued everything. And this actually he's a very interesting man. He was quite a philosopher and mathematician and physicist. And that actually came from an experience that he had of consciousness pervading everything. He had experimented with after images on the retina, where if you look at a light bulb too long, then you look somewhere else, you kind of see this after image. Well, he stared at the sun too long and went blind, and became so depressed that he remained in solitude, locked up in his house, keeping all the curtains shut and not letting any light in for, I think it was about a year. And he was a very spiritual and religious man as well. But after that time, he felt that something had transformed and changed in him, and he went outside and he saw everything is filled with souls. That's the way he put it in his more Christian context. He didn't have the language of Advaita Vedanta or any other Indian ideas, but he had this idea of souls. And so he said the rocks and the plants and everything had souls, and they were all alive. The whole universe was alive with this energy. So whereas if you read about him in Wikipedia or something, they don't tell you that this was from an experience. This just isn't a philosopher dreaming up something that sounds good or fits the information. He was talking from experience, just as Swami Vivekananda and Ramakrishna are talking from experience. They perceived the universe this way. They perceived everything as filled with consciousness. They didn't need a theory about it. Well, the scientific world's going to have to somehow come up with theories that fit. There shouldn't be two sets of truths, one spiritual and one scientific. There should be a way to get them to match. So hopefully somebody someday will be able to more specifically narrow some of these things down. And when we look at the world around us, we see so many mysterious things. It just seems that there has to be an overriding, guiding consciousness within the universe. Otherwise, how is it that evolution has insects that just perfectly match flowers so that the flowers are pollinated when the insect visits the flower? How does evolution go from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction? How do distinct species that can't interbreed arise from common parents? How do differences in chromosome numbers occur? How does evolution suddenly blossom forth after these cataclysmic events where most of the living organisms are destroyed and you're down to 5% or 2% of the original living organisms? And then suddenly this diversity of living organisms comes forth. So these are some of the mysteries that we see in biology. And how does the embryonic cell figure out how to differentiate? Here we are, we start as this little one-celled egg that's been fertilized by a sperm, and it divides into different cells that are all pretty much the same until a certain point, and all of a sudden they start to differentiate. And some of them start to develop into eye cells, and some develop into muscle cells and heart cells and so forth. And somehow there's this knowingness. And you can almost see the whole evolution of organisms going on within the development of the fetus into the organism that it's going to be. It goes through this whole evolutionary process as it develops in sort of a time-lapsed situation. Now, even Chalmers concludes in his investigations that conscious experience must have some sort of fundamental feature to it that's irreducible to anything that's more basic. And so there must be some sort of fundamental laws that govern its realm. And so as the physicists and the biologists and the neuroscientists, when they really get into this deeply, if they're not wedded to their model of materialism too greatly and are willing to open their minds and see how can this information possibly fit into some sort of framework, they begin to see that there has to be some all-pervading something. If you don't want to call it consciousness, it's something. It's a morphogenic field or whatever label you want to put on it. It's some sort of quantum fluctuation, whatever. But there has to be something with some name or a namelessness that pervades the universe, that connects it all together into a oneness. This all-pervading consciousness that's transcendent and yet immanent at the same time. In the Vayu Purana, it says everything exists in consciousness, and consciousness exists in everything. Elohim, the name of God in the Hebrew book of Genesis, could be translated the one that is many, or the consciousness in all. You know how words play, you can divide them up different ways. So the two ways of translating that one word would be the one that is many, or the consciousness in all. So both of those are very relevant statements for our topic here. Sri Ramakrishna said, "One day I plucked a leaf from the bell tree and a bit of bark fell off. I found the tree was full of consciousness. I perceived that it was God alone who had become all living things. They appeared as countless bubbles or reflections in the ocean of Satchidananda. Again, I find sometimes that living beings are like so many pillows made of indivisible consciousness. Once I was on my way to Burdwan from Kamarkapur. At one place I ran to the meadow to see how living beings are sustained. I saw ants crawling there. It appeared to me that every place was filled with consciousness." So consciousness can be a key to our spiritual understanding of the universe, and a good spiritual practice that we can do on an ongoing basis. That we can realize that everything that we're seeing, even though it's not our realization like Sri Ramakrishna, we can at least remind ourselves of that idea, that this is filled with consciousness. This is filled with consciousness. The reason I can see this is that it's really the same consciousness that's in me, that's just been projected backwards in space, or backwards in time and out in space. So Swami Ramakrishnananda, another direct disciple, said, consciousness must be found in consciousness. If you want to realize the all-conscious being, if you want to find your beloved, you must search in your consciousness. If you wish to realize God, you must go deeper and deeper within. When I was on the train to Chicago on the way over, I started talking to this very young man, about 24, turned out to be another musician. That's how we got started. He was studying a score, and I said, "Oh, you're a musician." Turns out he's going to Warsaw to be in a piano competition. But then I told him what I was doing and who I was, and so later he came up and said, "Can I ask you an interfaith question?" He said, and so he started asking me about, do you have a concept of God that's sort of managing the universe? So how do you answer that question in a short time with no background, in Hinduism? So I said, well, I had to give him a little background as to how we see the universe. But I said, so in a practical sense, in our normal experience, that's the way it's very natural for us to think, that there is some sort of being in the universe that's managing the universe and that is helping us, it's someone we can pray to and so forth and so on, and you can give it this name or that name, and it can take on these various aspects depending on what kind of function it might take. But I said, again, it's like your dream world. In the dream world, you're one of those characters in the dream, and there are all these other things in your dreams. And so these deity aspects, or God that's running the world, is like that aspect. And when you are fully realized, when you've used those tools of that God in that dream state, then you realize that it is you. Thou art that. Sway to Ketu. There isn't any other. But from a practical sense, of course, we can think that way, and most of us do. Most of us are practicing dualists because we're experiencing a world of duality. How are we doing this? We're supposed to end at 1, right? All right, so we just have a few minutes here. So these are the kinds of investigations that I find very interesting. And another one of my hobbies, I have way too many hobbies. Another one of my hobbies is gardening and hybridizing. And so ever since I was a little kid, I loved reading about people like Luther Burbank and George Washington Carver and these people, because these were what I call plant mystics. It's interesting, that Luther Burbank was actually a member of SRF, so he was not unfamiliar with these ideas. George Washington Carver seemed to be quite steeped in Christianity, but he had this very deep understanding of nature. And in some sense, he was a prime karma yogi. So as we had in our class last night, he was a practicing karma yogi. But they have the ability to intuit the life of the plants. Simply by opening themselves up to what the plants wanted, or what the plants needed, or what the plants were willing to do. And by opening their consciousness and expanding their awareness to include the consciousness of the plants, and feeling that the plants had consciousness, not just treating them as things, which is what most people do, that they were able to get the plants to do things that other people couldn't get them to do. There's a description in the book Secret Life of Plants about how when Luther Burbank had contacted some people on the East Coast to carry some of his new plants in their catalog, they came out to see him, and he had so many new and novel plants that they expected to see hundreds of employees all working and hybridizing with, acres upon acres upon acres of trials and so forth. And they came out and found this one little man with a couple of helpers, and they were just flabbergasted. They could not believe that one person created all of these plants, and it was because of his connection, his deep connection to the consciousness in the plants, that he was able to do the work that he did. So it's looking at the whole world that way. Don't just see things out there, see consciousness out there, and realize that you have that consciousness in you and that it can connect with that consciousness in someone else. Now, there are the theories of consciousness that are being sought after are striving to figure out how some of these anomalous things can happen in the universe. Some people try to ignore them, but the things that are troubling are some of the things that you might call kind of fringy or psychic. But the fact is that these phenomena are documentable and need explaining. And it's the feeling of some people that if you're going to have a theory of consciousness, you have to be able to explain all of consciousness, not just ordinary stuff. You can't just say, well, let's just cut consciousness down and talk about it this way so we don't have to worry about all this other stuff. That tends to be what people do. Most of the neuroscientists will define consciously so narrowly that animals aren't conscious. They don't even want to talk about animal consciousness, much less fringy stuff, or plants, or things like that. So to them, consciousness is just human consciousness when you're wide awake and aware of yourself. But what about mediumship? What about people that channel other entities? What about people that have multiple personalities or dissociative disorder, where different entities seem to take over the same body? What about the experiences of the mystics? What about people that have past life memories? What about people that have near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences? The people that are trying to get consciousness out of the brain and out of just the mind can't handle any of those things. And so they have to simply write them off as fakes or misunderstandings or misinterpretations or not really consciousness, or if they're really pushed, they'll say, well, it's some sort of psychic phenomenon. So people that are having a past life memory are really just picking up the thoughts of somebody else somewhere that's still alive. It's not that there's consciousness that exists after the body's gone. They're so wedded to the idea that consciousness has to come out of the brain that once the body's dead, the consciousness is gone and there can't be any other consciousness. But all of that evidence is virtually impossible to really explain unless you have some idea that consciousness is independent of the brain, and the brain is simply some sort of peculiar vehicle for consciousness, and maybe not a very good one. It almost appears that this brain is limiting our conscious experience. And if you read Raja Yoga, you can see that Swami Vivekananda will tell you that to truly be conscious of the world, the energy must go up the Sushumna and be free of the nerve connections in the body. And then the consciousness blossoms fully formed and is conscious of the universe in a complete and full way and not in an unhindered way. If you're limited to the neural pathways through the neural system, then your consciousness is limited. So there are all sorts of very peculiar phenomenon, such as people that have these near-death experiences that describe things around the environment that you couldn't normally see. There was one where she saw a pair of shoes that had been left on a ledge outside a window that you couldn't have seen unless you were outside the building. And there are cases of people that have channeled other entities that have talents that they just simply didn't have. They could speak foreign languages that they didn't know. They could play chess as a pro, which they didn't know how to do. So there's an existence of a conscious realm out there that our brains can sometimes tap into, sort of like your TV set being able to get a new channel or something. Most of us are fixed into one channel, but somehow some brains, and it's thought of as defective, but are able to pick up other channels somehow. and then that consciousness comes through in that sense. So there are all these peculiar things that seem to point that consciousness cannot possibly be a function of the brain, but is simply being channeled through the brain instead. Other interesting things are where cases where people have Alzheimer's, and as they decline, their memory goes. They can't remember people. They can't remember events. They can't remember what's been happening. They get angry and so forth, and their mood changes. And as they approach death's door, many of them have a very brief period of complete lucidity where they go back to their normal state of consciousness, even though the physical brain is still damaged. It makes absolutely no sense from the physicalist or materialist standpoint. If the brain was damaged and their manifestation of the disease process is due to their brain, how then do they have this sudden period of lucidity as they are making their transition? Makes absolutely no sense from that standpoint. So somehow the brain can work, even a diseased brain can work in a holistic way where parts of the brain can take over for other parts of the brain. And so this consciousness can manifest in ways that are not normal. When it's restricted to the normal way, it appears diseased. But at that moment of transition, it's able to go beyond that. The veil becomes thinner, and the brain works more as a whole organism. We're learning now, of course, that the brain is much more plastic than we thought it was, that we can manipulate the way our brain works. And in some cases, when people's brains are damaged, they end up actually manifesting new talents or new ways of looking at things. It's interesting, that Einstein is always thought of as this genius, and against his wishes, after he died, they did an autopsy on his brain, and they discovered that he was actually missing a region in his brain. Now, you would have thought he must have some real special connections in there. It was just the opposite. He was actually missing one region in the brain that is normally used for us to process verbal language skills. And he had always told people that he had trouble putting things into words, and he tended to think in pictures. So because his brain was wired differently, it forced him to think differently, and that's how he made his breakthroughs. He was thinking literally outside the normal box. The rest of us have this other way of doing things. He didn't have access to that. He had to do it another way, and his brain compensated. And there's a lot of evidence that our brains are able to compensate after various injuries and so forth, and different parts of the brain can take over for other parts. People that are struck by lightning will suddenly manifest musical abilities or an insatiable desire to paint or whatever. All sorts of peculiar things can happen when our neural system is shocked in some way or damaged in some way. And so the mystery of consciousness will undoubtedly occupy a great deal of our scientific inquiry. But for our spiritual life, I think our main focus is to just have that remembrance that the consciousness in you, while it feels like your individual consciousness, is really one with the consciousness in not just every one you see, but in everything that you see and experience in the world. Thank you.